Welcome to another of the Pensioners for Independence podcasts, and this one is brought to you by Edinburgh and Lothian's Pensioners for Indy group, who have asked Dr Kirsty Hughes to speak to them. Kirsty Hughes is Director and Founder of the Scottish Centre on European Relations. She's a researcher, writer, commentator on European politics and policy, and she's worked at a number of leading European think tanks. She herself was based over in Brussels for some while. More recently, her research focus has been on the UK, Scotland, and Brexit, and that features a lot in the podcast. She talks for about half an hour, and then there's a very lively session of question and answers after that.
Good afternoon, and it's great to be talking to you all again, and I look forward to our discussion. So I'm only going to talk for about 20 minutes is my aim. As Julia said, we agreed my topic just before Christmas, and of course that's just a month and a half ago, but there was so much uncertainty back then. If you remember all the sort of going to and fro to Brussels or virtual meetings or whatever, and of course the deal wasn't done till just before a few days before the new year. So what I really want to do is talk briefly about where we are now, and then I want to say something about how the European Union and the different member states, how they now see the UK and Scotland. And then I want to follow on from that with my sort of third main heading, if you like, for this talk, on how an independent Scotland's prospects now look for potential accession to the European Union. Where are we now? Well, as you all know, we've got a deal. As I just said, the deal came with almost no notice at all. And we're now 6 weeks or less in. And even if you only pay a cursory attention to the Brexit stories in the papers, we seem to be in a terrible mess. Much of that mess is not at all surprising. We've known for a long time that the Conservative government, even under Theresa May and then more so under Boris Johnson, was heading for a hard Brexit. But some of the sort of specificities, I think, of what's happening and what was agreed just at the end of December is quite extraordinary, and actually makes it an even harder Brexit than probably we all expected, and certainly people like me and many other trade experts and Brexit experts, you know, didn't expect the business and life would carry on as usual. But some of the, I don't want to call them wrinkles because they're much more damaging and important to people's lives than wrinkles, but some of the things that have happened as a result of the deal already are quite extraordinary. So the deal, we spent a lot of time, or the media spent a lot of time in the last year or more talking about deal or no deal. And so yes, it is a good thing that there's a deal rather than no deal. But if we look at what that deal does and how it wrenches us out of the EU's single market and customs union, it's a very bad deal. It's a very self-harming deal. And we knew already, and just remembering that there's, of course, in a sense, two parts to the deal. There's the trade agreement that came into force on the 1st of January, and there is the prior withdrawal agreement that Boris Johnson agreed in autumn 2019, and it's that withdrawal agreement that sets up the Northern Ireland Protocol that is also already causing many problems, as I'm sure you know. So basically, although the deal means, on the whole, it means no tariffs, the deal reintroduces, compared to what we had as members of the European Union and what we also had as our one-year transition period, it reintroduces a series of customs checks, VAT issues, and a whole range of regulatory barriers that tend to go under the heading non-tariff barriers. And that can cover all sorts of things in terms of having to prove that you meet the EU's health and safety criteria, that you meet their labeling criteria on products, that you meet their animal health, plant health. All these things go under the sanitary and phytosanitary label. And all these things are actually causing an extraordinary amount of problem alongside the fact that, of course, there is no longer suddenly, just in the last 5 to 6 weeks, there's no longer free movement of people. We don't have the right to just go and live in another EU member state for 6 months or a year. We certainly don't have the right to simply go and work there. And what we've seen is the deal so far is impacting people from musicians to the fashion industry, to the car industry, to the fishing industry, to the university sector and wider. The government chose, the UK government chose not to be part of the Erasmus student exchange scheme, and that's, as you know, I'm sure, a wider scheme that also used to apply to people like apprentices and so on. And that, I think, by the way, was an entirely ideological choice by the UK government. They actually agreed, and that's positive for the UK, including Scotland, they agreed to stay in the European Union's Horizon programme, which is a programme of advanced research across a range of different subjects that British universities have been very prominent in. But so if it was willing to do that, why wasn't it willing to let the Erasmus student exchange programme continue, instead of setting up its own so-called Turing programme, which is meant to be global, but actually only one way, so it only takes students from the UK to other countries, whereas Scotland benefited hugely up to now, but from having European students coming here and then getting to know Scotland, often staying for a time or longer to live and work here. So I think that was taken away for purely ideological reasons. If there's any logic driving Brexit, it does seem to lie in this wish of the UK government and the Tory party and Boris Johnson that we should be seen as global Britain, that we shouldn't acknowledge that we're on a European island off the continent of Europe, that our society, our culture, our values and our businesses are deeply entwined with other European countries, and were before we joined the European Union, but became more so over the 47 years we were part of the European Union. So I think that global Britain ideology impacted on choices like leaving Erasmus. I don't know if any of you have applied for your global health insurance card yet. It replaces the card you used to get, the European health insurance card, that allowed you to get some health treatment if you needed it unexpectedly when you were visiting another EU member state. And the irony is that this card only applies to EU member states, but it's been given this global name. It has a Union Jack on it when you get it. And again, it's just another example of this extraordinary ideology. Now, we might not have to get too upset about the Tories having an absurd global ideology if it wasn't actually impacting across the board on all these different sectors and many others that I've already mentioned. And some of it seems to have come as a surprise to the Tories. The fact that there are especially a lot of problems in the fishing sector, in the seafood sector, the shellfish sector, that the EU third country rules make it a problem to export live shellfish, or some of them actually cannot be exported, and others of them require, like other products, extraordinary amounts of bureaucracy, customs forms, veterinary checks, and so on and so forth. And the point here is that some of these rules are actually tougher for the UK than, say, New Zealand has with the European Union. And why is that? Well, that's because that's what the UK government agreed. It agreed not to align with EU animal and plant health and safety standards. And so it made a series of choices that made the border harder and made the impact harder. And I think there was quite a lot of discussion since the COVID pandemic started as to whether somehow the impacts of Brexit, because that's what we're talking about, the impact of Brexit, of leaving the customs union and single market, would somehow be hidden by the impact on the economy and people's lives of COVID. And I think at one level that's not happening, and it's good, because we want people to see what the real impact is. You know, when you listen to stories about West Coast of Scotland fisher communities, or when you listen to musicians or hear what they have to say on Twitter or on TV or radio, it's very clear what they're talking about is nothing to do with COVID and is everything to do with Brexit. But I think there is a real problem here, because I think because the news is so focused on COVID, this extraordinary damage to the UK economy, or I should actually say the British economy, because Northern Ireland has obviously got its own separate protocol, but this extraordinary damage is a direct result of upending half a century of economic relationships. And I think in the absence of COVID, this would be leading the news a lot more than it is at the moment. It's not helped, I think, by the fact that Keir Starmer, as leader of the Labour Party, has chosen to play it extremely cautiously, might say cowardly, in terms of calling this out. One of the shadow cabinet called a week or two back for more customs officers. I don't think, you know, in the face of this mounting damage, even in just a few weeks, but to say the answer is we need more customs officers is extraordinary. And of course, one of the things we see now with the particular problems with the operation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, because, as you know, as part of the withdrawal agreement, the one in autumn 2019, Boris Johnson, instead of doing what Theresa May had done and saying, well, for an indefinite period, the whole of the UK would stay in the EU's customs union, he said ideologically that clearly didn't work for the Tories. And so he agreed a deal that would keep Northern Ireland, as you know, in the single market for goods, and sort of in the EU's customs union at the same time as being in the UK's one. And so he deliberately fragmented the UK single market and put a border and a barrier down the Irish Sea. And of course, what we see in the row that has ensued in the last few weeks is there are a lot of problems with goods, and especially with fresh meat and things like that going to Northern Ireland from Britain. And we see the Tories lying and lying and lying again. And we've seen Boris Johnson do it again and say there wasn't a border, or there isn't a border, but there was always going to be a border. So we haven't moved on from fake news and lies about Brexit. And I think we're now moving into a different phase already, where instead of saying this was a great deal we negotiated, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson are basically saying this is the EU's fault. These are kind of EU rules. Well, this was a joint agreement. And yes, the EU got it very wrong 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, when it tried to trigger the emergency clause in the Northern Ireland Protocol to not allow exports of vaccines to go from Ireland across the open Irish border. But as you know, again, the EU got that wrong. They backtracked within a few hours. And yet somehow Gove and Johnson are trying to use this to say the fact that the Northern Irish Protocol creates this internal border is the EU's fault. An irony of ironies, they've also said, Michael Gove wrote a letter a couple of days ago, Tuesday, so last week, to the EU saying that they wanted some of the new checks and bureaucracy between Britain and Northern Ireland to not be implemented for 2 years. 2 years, a transition period. The Conservative government could last June have asked to extend the transition period for the whole of the UK for all sectors for 2 years. And they refused to, which is why, again, also it's why the Tory rhetoric that we see towards the Scottish government saying, how dare the Scottish government even mention independence when there's a pandemic going on? But the Tories didn't extend the Brexit transition when there's a pandemic going on. They agreed a free trade deal, not with 6 months to go, with some time to prepare for it. They agreed it with 6 days to go. So I think if anybody hoped that there might be a bit of a reset, that there would be any chance for our politics to be a bit more honest or positive, or a reset for the EU-UK relationship once there was a trade deal, I'm afraid that's looking unlikely. Is there possibly something good in that for Scotland and for the push for independence? Is it that the more the EU and UK don't get on, the more sympathy there is for Scotland? perhaps up to a point. But I think in general, it's actually in Scotland's interests that this very bad deal can at least be made to function, that things calm down, that in our rather challenging and unstable world, looking around the whole world, it would be better if the EU and UK got on. But that's certainly not what we see at the moment. Let me just say a little bit about how I think the EU does look at the UK and Scotland now. I actually wrote a paper on this that came out at the start of December, and that paper was based on talking to people in almost half the EU member states and in Brussels, a range of diplomats, journalists, academics, think tankers, people who are very much watching these issues. And let me start with what they told me about their view of the UK. And you can imagine that maybe that's not a very positive view. But what I think was very interesting and worth saying first is that most of the people I talked to started by saying how positive on the whole in many ways the UK was for their country when it was a member of the European Union. They talked about how influential it was, and they talked about, I talked to someone in Prague, and they were very positive about how the UK had been on their side vis-a-vis EU-Russia relations, or you talk to someone in The Hague in the Netherlands, and they might talk about how they very much agreed with UK policies on free trade. Or you talk to people in general and they say, well, perhaps the UK didn't quite have the level of influence that France and Germany acting together did, but because the UK was the third biggest country alongside those two in the EU, it helped to balance out the potential power of the Franco-German relationship. And that's one of the many knock-on effects onto the EU that's been happening, that the smaller countries in the EU are now saying it's changed the power balance. That's maybe a topic for a whole other session, but I think it's worth mentioning. Having said that, attitudes to the UK are very negative on the whole. The UK, or rather its government, is seen as untrustworthy. The UK's reputation is seen as being extremely badly damaged by the last 4.5 years. The UK's influence has been damaged by the UK itself and by the choices it's taken. And a lot of times people use the same word, baffled. They said we're baffled at what the UK has done to itself, and where has the professional and pragmatic UK gone? And yet, despite all that, people were keen that there should be a reset, that there should be a deal, and that if there was a deal, that might open the way to a more positive relationship in future, less Brussels blaming from London, more cooperation perhaps on foreign policy, on climate change, on security. At the moment, of course, if there's rows going on about Northern Ireland and about fisheries, that's probably not going to happen. And it's also not going to happen because at the moment we see the UK government very much, as I said at the start of this talk, trying to present itself as this global player. It refused to have a structured relationship with the EU on foreign policy, much as the EU 27 would have liked it. So I think the new relationship has started rather badly. And I think it's disappointing, if not surprising, that it's taken us back to that thing of London blaming Brussels for its own decisions, and that doesn't help build a constructive relationship. Well, where does, maybe I'll take another 5 minutes now to say more about where Scotland sits amidst all this. I think there's a very positive attitude on the whole towards Scotland. There's a very sympathetic attitude to Scotland. People are very, very aware that Scotland voted Remain, that Scotland wanted at the very least a softer Brexit, that Scotland did not want to leave the Erasmus programme. And it's interesting to see some of the members of the European Parliament do what they can to reach out to pro-Europeans in Scotland and also the rest of the UK. As one German MEP put it to me recently, she said, well, you know, it's one thing our relationship with the UK government, but it's another our relationship with UK citizens and with Scottish citizens. and we want to try and keep those relationships with citizens in the UK, and the EU is meant to be launching a big Future of Europe conference, a debate about strategies, democracy, what to do in terms of the big global picture next with the EU. And there are some people like Terry Ranke, a German Green MEP, who want to see if they can find ways for us to get involved still. Having said that, if you ask people about potential Scottish independence, I think the responses tend to fall into two parts. On the one hand, the idea of the UK fragmenting, people are perfectly aware of that as a possibility. Some see it as more likely than others. I don't find it surprising that on the whole, most people don't say, oh, we think it'd be great if the UK fell apart, or if the UK fragmented. You know, people are used to the UK being there. They're used to it being an influential state in Europe. It's had a big historical role. So at the same time, there's a bit of fascination about that. It's sort of, oh, well, if that happened, what would England and Wales be called? What sort of state would England and Wales be? So you get a mixture of responses. And I think mixed into that is that obviously the UK has been a nuisance. It's been a real problem and damaging to the EU in the last 4.5 years since the Brexit vote. So people aren't sort of looking forward to potentially more instability, if that's what the UK fragmenting might mean. Having said that, the second part of the response, I think, is if I put to people the scenario that there is an independent Scotland, a legally and constitutionally valid process that creates an independent Scotland, a 5 million strong country applying to join the European Union, then there's a fairly positive and or pragmatic approach to that. If the UK does fragment and there's Scotland, a small North European country, been in the EU for 47 years, been a democracy for a long time, had a social market economy for a long time, then the basic response is positive, and why wouldn't it be? And given that, as you know, there's an accession process towards the West Balkans at the moment, one that's been moving fairly slowly and is quite tricky for reasons connected to the political and economic and security history of those countries, then it's also quite common to hear people say on or off the record that if Scotland went independent soon, it might even leapfrog those countries in terms of how fast it could join the European Union. Let me just say another couple of things about Scotland's EU accession prospects. I think I talked quite a lot about that when I last met with you all. So that was the general picture. So in general, I think an independent Scotland would be welcome. It would be seen as relatively straightforward. A lot of the time, the debate about independence gets stuck on the currency questions and the deficit questions. On the deficit question, EU rules still say that member states should have a budget deficit under 3%, but that has also been suspended at the moment because of the COVID crisis and what that's done to debt and deficit levels as governments scramble to ameliorate the economic effect. And that has triggered quite a lot of debate about whether it's realistic to go back to these limits that are currently suspended. So I think there is an interesting question there about if we're on the cusp of perhaps some change in that. I don't think that means that the EU will simply agree that it doesn't mind what deficit or debt levels are, but we may be heading into a period of more flexibility. On the currency issue, and I've mentioned this on and off in some of my recent articles and comment pieces, there is no real precedent if an independent Scotland was still using the pound. For an accession country, a candidate country to the EU, to join using the currency of a state that isn't a member state of the EU. And it would make it difficult, if not impossible, while that was happening, for Scotland to meet some of the EU's criteria. For instance, treating its exchange rate with the Eurozone, assuming it joined but wasn't in the Euro, as a matter of common concern. Well, it couldn't control the pound exchange rate if the pound was being managed from London. Does that mean Scotland must have introduced its own currency before it could join the European Union? I think that's an open question, and I think it's a political question because this is unprecedented. So I think, imagine if Scotland had been independent for 3 or 4 years, it was using the pound, it had been negotiating its EU accession, and maybe it had a plan for in 2 years' time to switch to its own currency. I don't think the EU would necessarily say, well, you can't join for 2 years. If everything else was ready, if Scotland met all the other criteria for joining the EU, it's quite possible, it's conceivable that there could be a 2-year transition period within the European Union. But I can't say that definitively yes or no, because in the end it would be a political judgment for the member states it's not just a technical assessment by the European Commission. Last but not least, let me say something about border issues, and I imagine people may want to pick this up in the Q&A. If an independent Scotland was in the European Union, then the Scottish-English border would be an external border of the European Union. Hopefully that would be ameliorated by the fact that like Ireland, and independent Scotland could join the common travel area and be part of that with the rest of the UK and Ireland, so that at least there would be, that would actually be a win-win. There would be free movement of people with the UK and with the European Union. But otherwise that border will be quite a hard border in the sense that I described at the start of my talk. So especially for goods, unless things are eased in the next few years, or unless another more pro-European government comes in and negotiates something that brings the UK closer to the EU again, that border is going to have a lot of bureaucracy and problems around goods. What I didn't say so much about at the start of my talk, and I must come to a conclusion now, I've talked more than I said I would, is services. The UK-EU deal is a very bad one for services, and the UK and the Scottish economies are both very dependent on services. There isn't good access, and they're waiting for some so-called equivalence decision on financial services. But a lot of what now happens with services has to be bilaterally negotiated with the EU 27 member states to gain access to each state. What I wonder, but I think this needs more detailed work done on it, if Scotland's going to be an independent state in the EU, then it could have bilateral discussions with the rest of the UK about Scottish-English services being traded to and fro, where that wasn't already covered by an EU agreement on services and trade in services. So I think the border is challenging. It will have some negative economic effects, but they will be balanced out. And we could argue or discuss how much they'll be balanced out by being back in the European Union, by perhaps being seen as more open, I think, more positive place to come for foreign direct investment by the benefits of migration. And that study that was in the news last week, the LSE study, which estimated the border as being highly negative in that scenario, didn't take account of all these things. And of course, because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, actually, if both Scotland and Northern Ireland were in the single market for goods, then actually that bit of the border within the UK would, or the old UK, would get easier again. So I think, just in conclusion, I think in many ways, despite all the difficulties, all the problems of Brexit, and there's a limited amount that can be done for Scotland now and the Scottish government now to limit that damage from Brexit, but there is opportunities to really build our relationships with Europe, not just to let them be damaged by Brexit. People understand that Scotland didn't choose Brexit. They understand that we're on an island that's a European island, we're a European country. So I think we have to also build on those possibilities at the moment, as well as deal with the damage of Brexit. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I've talked for too long.
No, Kirsty, you have not talked for too long. That was really enjoyable. Now I'm going to hand over to Daniel, and he's going to go over the questions. Thank you.
Just give these to you, Kirsty, one at a time, and you can see whatever you like about them. Pippa asks, can you explain more what is Article 16 and what is Westminster's aim in now indicating that it wishes to invoke it?
So Article 16, I don't have it in front of me, but it basically says in a kind of emergency where there's grave risk of economic, deep economic and social disruption, this article can be invoked, but it's meant to be invoked through discussion with your partner, whether it's the EU or the UK invoking it. So it's meant to be invoked through a process of discussion, preferably first you talk and see if you can find ways not to invoke it. And then even if you do invoke it, you're looking for ways to be able to go back to the normal operation of the protocol. So I think, I think it was quite extraordinary. I think it's understandable at one level. The whole COVID pandemic and the stress of coming through this current wave, affecting so many EU member states very badly, just as it's affecting us very badly. And the Commission obviously mishandled it. They were in a panic about not getting the vaccines they thought they were about to get. They developed a general control regulation for exports of the vaccine so they'd know what was going on. And somebody put in this triggering of Article 16 so that it would apply between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and there wouldn't be a potential backdoor route into the UK. This wasn't only aimed at the UK, I should say, although there was about 100 countries in the Commission's regulation that it didn't apply to, but it applied to the UK, the US, to Japan. But as I said in my talk, it only applied for a few hours before it was taken off the website and didn't go through, and there have been a lot of internal ramifications from that. The Irish were clearly, in the Irish Taoiseach, were appalled and didn't know how that could have happened. And then you see the UK government and Johnson and Gove exploiting the fact that happened for a few hours and saying somehow this proves that all these other things, we can't export fresh British sausages, English and Scottish sausages to Northern Ireland. We've got all sorts of other problems that, as I said, come from the sort of agreement they did in the withdrawal agreement and the trade deal. And they're threatening, well, they were threatening to do it in reverse, but what they now seem to be doing is instead asking for simplifications, changes, asking for these 2-year sort of grace periods. Because what I also didn't mention, I think, is that there's a couple of 3 and 6 month grace periods in the application of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So if this is bad, I'm afraid it is actually going to get worse because there is going to be more checks. And so Michael Gove has been asking that, say, the 3-month grace period on some of the food controls should be extended for 2 years. But because he wrote his letter to Brussels last week in a tone that somehow suggested that this few hours of the Commission getting it wrong on Article 16 and getting upset about vaccines, as if somehow that was the fault. And so some of the reporting on how Brussels and the member states responding to Gove's letter is very badly is the answer. And it's not that the request is necessarily so problematic, but if you don't have good relations and you have this continuation of what I described, Britain blaming the EU for an agreement it chose, then managing that is very difficult. And this is, and we all know this is very serious politics, and this is as well as economics, this is the peace process as well as people's livelihoods. So I think this is potentially very serious. And whereas actually on that evening when the Commission got it wrong, I was very surprised. I was waiting for Johnson and Gove to overreact, and they didn't immediately overreact. In fact, they tried to calm things down a little bit on vaccines, but it didn't take very long after that for them to then turn it into this new problem.
Selma says, we won't get frictionless trade easily. Border questions, trade questions between Indy, Scotland and the UK will need to be countered. And the question thrown at you is, what are our arguments on this?
Sure. I think, the border. I don't think the border issues are simple, and they can't just be avoided or denied. There is always going to be, coming from the Tories at least, an answer to begin with of hypocrisy, because given the Tory government has put this border between Britain and the EU, it's put a specific half and half border between Britain and Northern Ireland. As you probably know or remember, there's also a sort of a border into Kent, because lorries, freight traffic going into Kent have to have a Kent access permit before they can go in there. So Brexit has put borders in all over the place. So to then say Scotland shouldn't put a border in and shouldn't rejoin the EU is inconsistent and hypocritical in terms of Brexiter logic. That obviously only takes the pro-independence argument so far, unless, and obviously there are some people on the independent side who don't want to stay in the EU or even the European Economic Area, but most people in Scotland, pro and anti-Indy, want to stay in the European Union. So we can't simply answer on the border questions, well, it's hypocrisy and that's it, because we can't say, look, Brexit's really bad for the UK economy, including the Scottish economy, and then we're not going to worry about borders for the Scottish-English border. What I would like to see, you may have seen these news reports of this LSE study last week, and somebody had said it meant that everybody would be £2,500 a year worse off, or something like that. And I saw various calls for, well, where's the rebuttal, and who is our rebuttal unit, and where's the rebuttal? I think we need something more than just rebuttal, because I think we need to be able to say, yes, we need to estimate the costs of putting a border between Scotland and England. Yes, we'd rather England and the rest of the UK had stayed in the European Union. And because it hasn't, given we now know the trade and cooperation agreement, we ought to be able to do an economic estimate of the costs of the border. Some of that particular LSE study assumed what some of those costs were from the beginning. So, you can critique particular studies, but rather than just rebut them, I think you need some economic studies of different scenarios, because yes, Scotland trades more with England than it does with the European Union, about 3 times more at the moment. I mean, the statistics are far from perfect, but anyway, that's an order of magnitude. And that's only about half of Scotland's external trade goes to the EU, and the other half goes to the rest of the world, though some of it's still in Europe, just not in the EU. But I think if Scotland was in the European Union, I think it would be a very attractive base for foreign direct investment. A lot of American investment came into the UK down the decades because of being close to and then in the European Union and being an English language speaking country. So I think Scotland would have that advantage. Skilled population, and with free movement again, and EU citizens able not just to stay here but to come here would be beneficial. So can we get some realistic estimates or different scenarios of what that would look like? Can we get some estimates of what I call the win-win? There's not many win-wins around Brexit, but there's this idea that we could get free movement in the EU of people and free movement in the UK, is surely another economic win-win. What is the overarching industrial strategy and economic strategy and green strategy for the first 5 years and the first 15 years of independence? How much might trade shift? How much does it have to shift to be able to say, here's some positive economic benefits? And also going back to what I briefly said in the talk about services, there will be some barriers to services trade between the UK, the rest of the UK, and an independent Scotland. Some of those issues will be managed at EU level, and Scotland will have a voice in that, but some of those will be managed bilaterally. Which of those, given the current agreement, will be and could be managed bilaterally? What's the economic value of that? So in a sense, what I'm setting out here is, I started my career as an economist, but then I moved into doing more political analysis of Europe. So I'm not volunteering to do this, but you know, that's how you would set out an economic study. And I've not seen that. I've not seen that done. And I think, you know, when I used to say this, I've banged on and off for the last 4 years about borders as an impact of Brexit. And some people would say to me, oh, well, Kirsty, it's fair enough that the SNP doesn't really look at this until we know what sort of trade deal. Because obviously, if we'd done a trade deal of staying in the single market, the economic impact would have been much less than the sort of trade deal we have now. But we do have this trade deal now. And so I think in terms of, there are answers back, but I think they'd be much more persuasive if there was some more serious public domain work from the pro-independent side and from the SNP itself. It needs to come, I think.
Okay. So how quickly should that work be done, Kirsty? Should it be in place in the next? Should it be done before our election, or should it be done in the?
You know, I hear from different sources that there are policy papers that haven't been released yet. One, as I understand it, on EU accession, and one more broadly on the economy. And I don't have any specific roots in or knowledge of what sort of SNP or Scottish Government thinking is on whether to release those as part of the election campaign or not. But I think if those papers are there, they should be released. And I think if that paper doesn't include an estimate of the borders, then I think, yeah, there should be some first estimates done. I mean, this is going to be an election about independence, and therefore we need, in the context of Brexit, so we do need some more analysis, yes. But I'm also surprised. I mean, I've said the SNP should do this, but you know, I'm surprised there aren't more academic and university estimates of this. I mean, there may be some I've missed, but it seems to have been something that's been a bit absent. And when you look at what happened with Brexit, you had all sorts of different economists from different universities here and in the EU estimating what the impact on trade in goods and services would be. And they did vary. I mean, they pretty much all found it as a negative impact, but they varied quite a lot in their assumptions and their results, in whether they took account of productivity and foreign investment. So I think if we're being serious, we have to do that for Scotland too, yeah.
Thank you for that. That's great. Pippa asks, is there any way that the Scottish Government could just work with the EU directly, whether that be right now or just after, prior to a referendum? Your thoughts? I
mean, I think the Scottish Government already does try and have good communication with the European Union. I was actually speaking on a panel with Alan Smith a week ago, and he was talking about his contacts with different EU embassies and diplomats and so on. I noticed at the start of the year that Nicola Sturgeon had written a column about independence in the EU, and it was published in various European outlets, and there are Scottish Government so-called hubs in Dublin, in Paris, in Berlin. There was talk a year ago about opening another one, possibly in a Nordic country, and that doesn't seem to have happened. So I don't know what happened with that. So I think that, you know, there is communication, and pre-pandemic there was a certain amount of travel and meeting with ministers, and some of that travel and meetings was quite interesting. Given that Nicola Sturgeon is First Minister but not a head of state, because Scotland's not currently a state, nonetheless, there were some quite positive signals by which ministers she met in Berlin and that sort of thing that were meant to not too much offend the UK government, but at the same time show that there was a certain friendly attitude to Scotland. I actually wrote a column that was in the National yesterday saying in a sense you could say it's an answer to your question, but saying that there is more that could be done now, because there is a lot already going on Europe, and there's this attempt to see if there's any way Scotland could stay in or rejoin Erasmus. It doesn't look likely, but they're still not quite given up. We've got the big climate summit coming to Glasgow in November, and again, it's a global summit. The UK government is the host, but nonetheless, there will be a lot the Scottish government can do, and I'm sure is planning to do. But what I argued in my article yesterday was that I think the Scottish government should be intensifying contacts with the EU member states. Okay, it doesn't have huge amount of resources and it doesn't have a foreign office, but for instance, when I did a paper earlier last year on small states in the European Union and how they work together to have voice and influence, and they may specialize in particular areas, so that people would often refer me to Denmark and Sweden on climate issues as being kind of leaders or important voices on those issues. So we shouldn't overestimate what Scotland can do. It's outside the EU, it's not an independent state. But actually, Scotland has a lot to say on climate, and if it went in for some more what you might call para-diplomacy of trying to talk more to the Danes or the Swedes on these issues, then it can try and amplify its influence and its voice by working with others. But I think, having said that, I think that's a sort of diplomacy, but it's not. You can't pretend you're a state if you're not a state. So you can't go and have negotiations where you're not allowed to have negotiations, where the EU can only recognise third country states. But the other part of the question was what about pre-referendum? I'm more interested in what about post-referendum, to be honest. I mean, I think what you'll find pre-referendum is that the EU governments will in general be neutral. They'll say we can't interfere in a third country's constitutional processes. But I think, as we've seen already in the last couple of years, I think there will be more willingness to say any European state can apply to join the European Union, that if Scotland was independent, of course, it would be eligible to join the European Union. We saw Donald Tusk, the former European Council president, say that, was it 1 or 2 years ago? It's easier to say things when you're no longer in your official position. But I think, why I said it's interesting after a referendum, assuming a yes vote, is normally what you would expect to happen after a yes vote is that there's talks between the UK government and the Scottish government about the divorce, just as we saw with Brexit in a sense. You've got to have a sustained discussion over your future relationship and ending the current relationship. And normally you might expect the EU to stand back from that and say, you sort that out, you come to your agreement, London recognises independent Scotland, then the rest of us arrive. But I think if you think about it, that gets a bit tricky, because if you did agree between London and Edinburgh, and you had your Independence Day was going to be, 1st of January 2025 or whatever, if you haven't already talked to the EU, what happens on that 1st of January? Because the deal the EU had with the UK no longer applies to the whole of the territory of what was the UK. And the deal on fish that has proved so problematic, unsurprisingly to those of us watching, well, it won't apply to all of the UK's territorial waters, because they'll no longer be all of the UK. Some of those will be Scottish territorial waters. So there's going to have to be something in place for that first day of Scottish independence that works for Scotland, the rest of the UK and the EU. And I don't think this means you can leapfrog. I don't think this means that there's any way at all of suddenly being back in the single market or the EU on day one. But actually, I think there may have to be three-way talks at some point. And I think there's another area that needs a lot more discussion and consideration about these transition out of the UK into the EU, and that particular trend, it's going to have quite a big impact. That deal that's just been done 5 weeks ago is going to have to change. And I think that's actually very interesting topic in itself.
Thank you, Kirsty. I was just thinking of the fun we could have, not us personally, but our diplomats talking to the rump of the UK Parliament and the EU at the same time. Look at the opportunities for creating mischief. Again,
I'm sure they wouldn't do that.
of course not. No. To go back to comments from other people, Tony Young has made two comments on this question of deficit. And she says, and I think we'd agree, that the deficit is a UK construct as part of the GERS figures. And an independent Scotland would probably not take on a share of the UK deficit or debt. And Tony's making reference here to a lot of the analysis work that Richard Murphy does, which you're probably aware of. Mm-hmm. Also, she says, a nation with its own currency may need to run a deficit. Again, reference Richard Murphy and Tim Rideout. Any thoughts on that? Or shall we just jump on to the next one?
I think what's difficult from the statistics and from the different scenarios is indeed to agree, in order to have the discussion and the debate, to agree what the likely deficit is of a future independent Scotland. You know, that's the question. What are the actual figures? What would the economic prospects and situation of an independent Scotland look like for the first year and the 5 years and 10 years? And actually, I think the question about not taking on a share of the debt or deficit, well, there are obviously different views on that. At one level, it might seem reasonable to take on a share, a population share, or you might argue, well, no, because we think you spent it on the wrong things, or because we're a new state and you should help us as a decent global citizen. I think what adds to those arguments now is obviously COVID. You know, because the debt has shot up quite rightly. Because quite rightly, you need to try and support your economy in this extraordinary crisis. Yeah. Is an independent Scotland going to take on some share of that? So, I mean, that's an open political question. But I think it's not realistic, even if you weren't going to join the European Union, it's not realistic to just say you can run a deficit of any size, and that you run it by printing Scottish pounds. I think that's a route to inflation, and I think the idea that Scotland can just be I'm trying to think the right way to put it. It's not just it tends to be associated with the left. Can you just have socialism in one country and not be in the European Economic Area and not be in the European Union and spend all you like because you keep printing all the pounds you want and not worry about how all the other economies in the world are behaving, how international financial markets behave, or what EU criteria are? I don't think that's sensible either. So I think we have to have. I don't think it's just Richard Murphy versus Andrew Wilson. I think there are other intermediate positions on that. I'm probably more of a Keynesian myself, but I'm a Keynesian who doesn't think, despite COVID, that there is simply a magic money tree. I think if you look around the European Union, you've had all sorts of countries join. Some of them were long-standing countries that had come out of dictatorship, Greece or Spain. Some of them were countries that had been states and were then absorbed into the Soviet Union and then regained their independence. So, Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. Some, like the former Czechoslovakia, split into two states, and they came in with different types of economy and levels of economic problems and the need to establish themselves as a state. So I think at one level there is a lot of experience in the EU, as well as obviously at UN level, of how you establish a new state, how you establish a currency, what sort of transitions you may need, what sort of support you may need. And I think it's perfectly feasible to establish a Scottish currency faster if you wanted to. But I think you've got to be realistic about, do you want to join the European Union or not? I know some people say, well, let's just join the European Economic Area. Personally, I think that would be a very odd thing to do, because you'd be saying, we're a newly independent state, we've got self-determination, but now we're going to let the EU set all our rules and everything else, and we're just going to have them applied to us like in Norway and Iceland. And I do rather wonder if Norway had succeeded in its initial aim in joining the EU, if people would be so keen on that option if it was only Iceland and Liechtenstein. But that's another, sorry, I've probably taken too long to answer that. There's another whole seminar in that one as well.
Marlene makes comment about EFTA. You've mentioned EEA, and EFTA, of course, an interim stage there, and saying that might be good for us pragmatically to let us get on with the work needed post Indy, and maybe it would help some less pro-EU Scots to vote yes in an independence referendum. Do you think we would be accepted by the EFTA countries if we asked to join as a newly independent state?
I think there's a lot of confusion about EFTA and the European Economic Area. So EFTA has 4 members, the European Free Trade Association. It's got Norway, Switzerland, Iceland and Liechtenstein, and it's up to those 4 countries who comes in. But that does not give you access to the EU's single market. It just means you're part of a small trade body that tries to do a certain number of joint trade agreements. The European Economic Area has 3 of those countries in it, but not the Swiss. And it has all 27 of the EU member states in it. So there are actually 30 members in the European Economic Area. And the European Economic Area is basically the EU single market, but not its customs union and not its agriculture and fish. So they would all have to agree. And also, would Scotland meet all the single market criteria? In that sense, it's no different to joining the EU. You'd have to get agreement and you'd have to meet the criteria. And so I don't particularly see that as easier for an independent Scotland. And what would normally happen if Scotland wanted to rejoin the EU is that in the time when the talks would be going on, there would be a Scotland-EU association agreement that would start in advance of that to reduce trade barriers, to increase cooperation, and it would be tailored specifically to Scotland rather than going through the EA. And then lastly, on this question of would it help people who might be anti-EU but pro-EEA to vote yes? I mean, there's different ways of doing that. There's no one right answer to that. But I mean, I personally, if I was a politician, I would be arguing for doing what all the Central and East European countries did, and what they did was to, I guess they had elections. That was their aim. They elected parties who said they wanted to join the EU. They negotiated to join the EU, and then they took it to a referendum. So and of course, and they all said yes, but the Norwegians did that too, and the Norwegians said no. So I don't think it's not just some sort of cop-out. If you want to say to people, look, most people in Scotland at the moment want to join the EU, but after independence, when they look at the border issues with England or the deficit issues or other arguments about the EU and the euro, they would have a choice, so that you don't have to think in voting yes to Indy that you're voting yes to the EU if there's going to be a future referendum. And people say, oh, how many referendum are we going to have? But that would be 3 or 4 years down the line, and it would be absolutely normal behaviour for a European country trying to join the EU. So I know there are people arguing that we could join the EEA and that we must split the EU argument from the Indy argument. Personally, I don't agree with that, and I think if you want to split it to some extent, you do by the fact that you could have a referendum later.
Marlene goes back to the question of Erasmus. Is there any way that we in Scotland can rejoin Erasmus while still in the UK? I think you may have spoken about that already. Are we likely to get help? I know we're working with the Welsh Government on this, and I know that Westminster set its cap firmly against it. But is there any chance that we could persuade the Irish Government to actually piling on our side, and just because they like causing England problems anyway. So
Sponsoring the Scots.
sponsor a fellow Celt, you know.
I think, well, discussions are ongoing, as I understand it, with Brussels. But Brussels spokespeople have come out a couple of times recently to say, in general, it's a country that's part of Erasmus, and it's not part of a country that's part of Erasmus. I don't know what the details of the conversations are at present, but I suspect they're about, if the UK government rejoined, could it, which of course it said it's not going to, could it rejoin so it was only Scotland and Wales that took part? I don't know if the Commission would say that was possible, but I think it would require UK agreement, and I think we can all form our own ideas on that, but I very much doubt the UK government would do that. Your side comment on Ireland is interesting. What I see of the Irish government diplomacy is it's trying to get on with the UK government, as well as with Scottish and Welsh governments, as well as the whole separate structures of the Good Friday Agreement. And it recently opened a Consul General office in Cardiff, and the Irish Consul General has been the most active diplomat in Scotland in recent years. So I think Ireland plays those, you know, UK is its big neighbour, and it plays that as a pretty sophisticated foreign policy, and its ability to help Northern Ireland with Erasmus is different from its ability to help Scotland, unfortunately, with Erasmus. And I do think it's outrageous, you know, I mean, the whole of Brexit is outrageous, but you know, we saw after 2016, even with Theresa May, there was no effort made to try and reconcile the Scottish and Northern Irish votes with the English and Welsh votes. And there was no effort to recognise that a very big majority of younger people voted for the EU and are in favour of the EU. So instead of taking younger people's concerns on board, at least with something like Erasmus, again, that possibility to at least try and, you know, smooth some of the rough edges of Brexit, the government is talking only to its own supporters.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, if you think of Irish diplomacy, and I know it's almost 100 years since they became a state in their own right after 1,000 years of fighting against the English, but they've managed to reduce their trade level with England. They talk about England rather than the UK. They've reduced their trade level from 90% in 1922 down to 20%. So that's a whole hell of a difference that they've made. They're very good at working on their own right, as I would expect Scots to be when we get the chance to do so. Do you think because of Brexit, Ireland will reunite before Scotland can be independent again?
Yeah.
You don't have to answer that if you don't want to.
It's not impossible. I think, you know, I think the two are very interconnected. They're both very separate, obviously. You know, Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, there can be a border poll. Reunifying with Ireland is a different and would be done differently to Scotland going independent. But politically, they're very likely to have knock-on effects on each other, whichever goes first. So whichever went first and chose to leave the UK, I think would have a reinforcing effect on the other. And it's also interesting, you know, if you talk to people across the EU, as I do, then both tend to come up. I mean, I've done a lot of media in the last 6 months. There's been a lot of European media interest in Scottish independence, especially as the polls have shifted. But yeah, this question does come up of both, and what will happen to the UK and or the rest of the UK, or England and Wales, what you call it, and or even Welsh independence. So that's not something that people outside the UK, I find, are speculating on much so far. None of that's a direct answer to my Northern Ireland move first. I think my answer a year ago would have been Scotland's more likely to move first. A lot of people, as I'm sure you mostly are aware, in Dublin, people have been a lot of people quite cautious about moving quickly, wanting it to be consent on both sides, really understanding what the pros and cons are, the transitions, the new constitutional structures, not leaving an alienated unionist minority. A lot of very sophisticated and deep thinking going on about those issues, much more so than here on, it's not exact mirror image of, but what are our relationships would be with England and Wales after independence. So it would be nice to see more work done on that too. I think because of the Northern Irish Protocol and the way it's not malfunctioning, it's functioning as you would expect it to function, which is it's causing a lot of problems and it's causing a hard border. They may be able to do something about this, but even the pet passport issue applies for even within the common travel area, because of the Brexit agreement. Whether that might change the dynamics sooner than would have been expected otherwise. Different opinion polls show different things in Northern Ireland. It might change the dynamics, but I think that's very unpredictable, and obviously it's very disturbing to see the threats against port staff in Northern Ireland in the last week. So I don't know is my final answer, but those are the things I would speculate about, and whether this may all take off faster than we expected. But at the moment, that's obviously what seems to be happening here as well. Whether it's 20 or 22 polls now showing yes, as only since last June. So I certainly wouldn't go along with those saying it's the settled will of the Scottish people. I think you need more than 7 months to call it the settled will, but it is looking like a watershed move, and we'll see what happens, with the salmon sturgeon row and everything else, whether that dents support ahead of the May election. So it's not meant to be my topic for today, I know. But actually it doesn't seem to be. So, and it's interesting to see how the media discussion in London is changing as more and more of these independence polls came out, and you see more and more a range of commentators in London saying, "Ooh, actually, Boris can't just say no, can he?" Well, I mean, he may well just do that, but a lot of people starting, influential voices starting to say, "Oh, well, you can't just keep saying no if that's what people in Scotland want." So, yeah, this thing could play out slowly. It could play out very quickly in both.
Yeah,
I think, and I guess it's just a personal comment, I do get very anxious of the fact that things may go on taking years, but in the years to come, Scotland is going to be absolutely damaged. We'll lose so many jobs, industries will close, that I just feel it will be harder and harder and harder to come back from that situation the longer it takes. But that's just a personal comment.
Well, but I do think on that, I mean, this is going back to the question, sorry, I can't remember by who, but about, what are our countering arguments on the border being bad? But I mean, I think there's a general political economic point here that we are currently part of a state that chose to do this degree of damage to its economic, political, social and security and cultural relations, all its European allies and partners. And if you're part of a state and a government that's willing to damage its economy to that extent, do you want to stay part of that, even if there may be some economic costs in the short run? Or do you want to get back, and we may have different views on what's a rational economic policy, but do you want to get back to a sort of more rational economic policy based on a more honest political debate?
Florence says, do you feel that England will be excessively vocal about foreigners entering England v Scotland once we are independent? And will this be another border problem for them, or it will be another border problem to be answered during a referendum campaign? I don't think it should be such a problem, just because the Common Travel Area already works with Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That has worked by Ireland, although it's in the EU and therefore has free movement, not being part of the Schengen
passport-free, border-free zone, although as we've seen with COVID, it's not a completely passport or border-free zone. Member states have the right to reintroduce borders for their health and protection and security and so on. And so I think if Scotland does stay in the common travel area, which would need rest of UK and Irish agreement, but I really can't see why that wouldn't be forthcoming, then you would expect that if it was also joining the EU, it would, like Ireland, ask for a Schengen opt-out, and for the same reasons that Ireland got a Schengen opt-out, it would get an opt-out from having to be part of the border-free, passport-free area. And it would need as a bit as Ireland does to make sure it didn't have such a different migration policy to the rest of the UK that there was an issue. Excuse me. And I mean, it's very early days. Well, it's early days since free movement only stopped on the 1st of January. But so far, we haven't seen anything much about the media saying, oh, look, people are coming from Ireland who shouldn't come from Ireland. And of course, what the deal does allow with the EU is that you can have visa-less travel when we're allowed to travel again from the UK to the EU for up to 90 days out of 6 months, is it for tourism and for a rather, unfortunately, restricted number of professional or business reasons. So, people who can come to Ireland for free movement can come onto the UK, but they no longer have a right to live and work here. They have that right to live and work in Ireland, and that would be the same for Scotland. So I think Ireland is very, very helpful here, because if anybody says, oh, look, this could be a problem, well, up till now, we can say it's not at all a problem, vis-a-vis Ireland and vis-a-vis the common travel area, and it's working. So as long as it's working, we can point to it and say it's working.
Yeah. Thank you.
We do actually have, Daniel's asked me to try and actually vocalise this one. It's from Selma, who unfortunately has had to leave. So I'll do my best. You can see it as well, Kirsty. We need to have answers if we're speaking to people, I suppose, is what she's saying. Yeah. And I agree.
Well, I agree, and of course you do. And in case there was any misunderstanding of what I was saying, I wasn't saying that policy papers are somehow being leaked to foreign media and not being published here. What I did say was that I understand from talking to people here that there are some policy papers that have yet to be published. Now, I'm not completely privy to why they haven't been yet, but I would assume it has quite a lot to do with the pandemic, and that may be fair enough. But obviously, we're now 3 months or less off the election. So something has to happen soon, because we need to have democratic elections, and that means being able to seriously discuss policy. And for activists, that means you having advance notice as well of the arguments. Now it's a little bit, I'm not taking sides on the Andrew Wilson, Richard Murphy right this second, but I was slightly puzzled to see a Financial Times article by Andrew Wilson a week or so ago, saying we need a more strategic and clear economic policy. Well, I was slightly puzzled was because, because he is the author of the Growth Commission, and yes, the world's changed a lot since the Growth Commission, so of course he's quite right. At one level, we need something new. Well, I thought that was slightly baffling, and unless it's a precursor, him saying it, and then in another couple of weeks he goes, oh, hello, I actually happen to have this economic policy.
I mean, the Growth Commission was pretty much binned by conference a year or so ago, and yet I saw Andrew Wilson in an interview with Andrew Neil for The Spectator in December, saying, oh yes, we would keep the pound, we would just carry on with that, and after all, we're using the pound just now, etc., etc. So for us as activists, who I think we're pretty much in the place where we felt we would be starting our own currency as soon as possible, we don't have answers to any questions at the moment coming up to the election. Now, I know we're not on stalls just now, we can't get out there and talk to people, but I still think there is a serious need for the public to be starting to see questions about borders, currency, as you say, policy papers. I think it's time.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I think there are sort of answers and on all these things. I also think, how to put this, I think we have to make sure we have enough points and comments on the positive side. You know, what I find, because I write so much and talk so much about accession to the EU and could an independent Scotland do it and what would the issue be, and then everybody starts talking about deficit and currency. Well, yes, those are issues to discuss and debate, and actually I think it's fine that there's a range of views on that in the independence movement, just as there are, you know, outside the independence movement. But it's not a right to rush over the fact that of the about 35 so-called chapters that have to be negotiated and aligned with before you can join the EU, Scotland currently meets almost all those criteria. You know, the UK as an EU member state had a couple of opt-outs, had an opt-out on the euro, obviously, and it had an opt-in on the justice and home affairs area, and the Schengen that I already mentioned. Well, that's huge. You know, that's huge for the moment until we diverge, and depending how fast or slowly we diverge from EU regulations and so on. So I think much more needs to be made about that, you know, and especially, and it links to the border argument and diverging from England, is say, but actually we're trying to stay with how our economies work at the moment. I mean, not completely in terms of independence, but, you know, we're not trying to destroy our European standards and our European connections. I think on that regard, you know, it's funny, the Growth Commission report has come down to an argument about currency. Obviously, it did actually have quite a lot in there about competitiveness and other things that I find quite interesting and still relevant on, you know, do we want to be like Denmark or Finland? Can we be like them? And what sort of industrial strategy does that entail? My criticism of the Growth Commission at the time was that it rather ignored Europe and the European Union and EU industrial strategy arguments and made it much more small state by small state comparison. I think on the currency side, I think people need some very clear bullet points about, because I've seen Andrew Neil sort of say, you cannot join the EU if you're using the pound. And actually, I too made that point when I wrote a blog critiquing the Growth Commission, but more for ignoring Europe almost 3 years ago now. But actually, I've changed my view on that a little bit, partly by talking to people in the EU about the unprecedented nature it would be of using sterling and perhaps wanting a transition period, and that it would be a political decision. And it's not right for either me or Andrew Neil to say it's absolutely impossible. So I think, you know, whether you think Scotland should have its own currency on day one, or whether you think it's fine to take a few years about it and use the pound, I think you need to have the arguments there about what that would mean for joining the EU. And I think the other thing it's just where we are politically and in terms of public opinion, but because people see the euro as problematic somehow, then instead of thinking, well, could all this argument be eased if we were more positive about joining the euro? You know, Ireland uses the euro. The discussion tends to be about how we could join the EU while having a euro informal opt-out, like not like Denmark, which has a formal one, but like Sweden or Poland, because if you don't join to begin with, you can't be made to join. And you know, I wonder if one of the arguments also for defending a Scottish currency is what would the reserves need to be to keep a relatively fixed exchange rate between the Scottish pound and the euro? Because I think a lot of the fear, I understand it, on introducing a Scottish currency is you don't want it to devalue against the pound straight away. Because otherwise, everything you've said to people about, oh, you'll defend their pensions and so on, could get threatened. So, and you know, I'm not in favour of the fiscal deficit limits or the way Greece was treated in the euro crisis. But as I say, I think to some extent in the midst of the COVID crisis, things have moved on for now. And I think thinking more about the euro in terms of currency plans is perhaps something ideally we should do more of, but I don't think that's going to happen probably in the next few months in the run up to the election.
Marlene says that she was in a meeting with Kate Forbes last week, where she made the point that people need to have reassurance about currency stability immediately after Indy. So according to Kate, we'd use sterling, but then a move to our own currency would start ASAP. Marlene says, unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to pin her down to define the ASAP. So it's just a comment. But let's, at least it's positivity. I think from my point of view, I'm hearing positivity from a member of the SNP government, and that's reassuring.
Yeah, and I think it's what I just said. What it doesn't have to take you years and years to introduce a currency, and I think people like Andrew Wilson are well aware of that. But it is this issue of currency stability. I mean, when the Czechs and Slovaks split up, they used the same currency for a little while, and then they decided that didn't work. And I think within about 6 months, Slovakia had its own currency, but it then devalued 20% against the Czech crown. So. And I mean, we're now 27 years later, and that for them is ancient history. But, we can't just dismiss it and say it'll be fine in another 10 years' time. Obviously, you've got to take account of the sort of divorce agreement you might have with the rest of the UK and how that will impact on things like acquired pension rights and so on. So I'm not an expert on the different arguments about currency stability and reserves and so on, but I think that's where a lot of these issues come to.
Okay. I think so. I personally don't like the idea of the Bank of England being in charge of any money we might require to borrow. I think it would be pretty bitter between the two countries, and I really don't want to be relying on the Bank of England. I also heard one quite smart economist say that he reckoned just the fact that Scotland has so much oil that can be used as a reserve for our currency, that would back it up. I don't know, because I'm not an economist.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the case anymore, given where we're getting to in fossil fuels. But yeah, I share your hesitation about using the pound without agreement, without any control. You've seen other countries, Montenegro and Kosovo, using the euro without the agreement of Brussels, and they're moving rather slowly towards the EU, and Kosovo's not even been recognised by Spain and others yet. But the EU hasn't refused to talk to them because they're using the euro. So on the one hand, there's the arguments about the currency and exactly how that's done, and then there's the arguments about what it does to the ability to join the EU, and also and I think these things interlink. So going back to what I was saying about not necessarily seeing EFTA or the EEA as a sort of halfway house, because the EU will set up a formal association agreement with Scotland very quickly, I would imagine. Now that's part of then Scotland's relationships with the biggest market in the world, and that will impact. It'll be one of the factors that will impact on currency and on the putative strength of a new currency, but it'll only be one of the factors. But it's not going to be, or it shouldn't be, just in my view, an independent Scotland that's somehow cut off from the UK market, cut off from the EU market, using the pound without permission. It's going to take 10 years to get back into the EU, and that's all going to be disastrous for 10 years. I don't think that's the case, but I think, however it's done, there is no way getting around the fact that independence involves transitions, and it will involve a transition into the EU. And I don't think it doesn't in the end matter if that transition is 3 years or 6 years, as long as we have some decent agreement with them for trade in the meantime. And in a way, the same for leaving the UK. Of course, if your aim is independence, you don't then want to have things run by the UK, but you're always going to have. We're on the same island, we're going to have to do a lot of things together. And as we unwind things, there will be transitional in between deals, and some of them, different people will be happier or more unhappy with, as they come. But I think it might help if we use that transition word now. People are used to the concept of transition because of Brexit, even though it was unfortunately short and badly handled. But there are good transitions. You're not going to have a fully fledged diplomatic service with embassies all around the world on day one. You don't need that. You need your transition strategy for how you build that up. You're not going to suddenly switch your trade from the UK to the EU in 1 year. Hopefully what you are going to do, maybe even before you divorce, is have an agreement on Scottish-UK services trade, So we need to have an idea of some of the key components of services and which ones can happen quickly, which ones more slowly, what the options are on those. And it's, and it's going to be negotiation with the EU as well as with the UK. And then when you finally get to a more settled state, will be over a period of time, and not just on currency, on lots of things.
Absolutely. I don't relish that. I don't relish those negotiations.
Okay. Florence Sinclair asks or says, self-determination is about a great deal more than economics. It's about the way that we want to go forward with our nation. And well-being. What do you feel about this, giving this a much higher profile? Economics is critically important, we know, but we're just looking at how else do we take the nation forward?
Yes, I do think that's right. And when I'm talking to people from other European countries, and they say, "Oh, is there a majority in Scotland for independence now because of Brexit and COVID?" And I tend to say, well, that's tipped it over the 50%, but remember there was 45% in 2014, and it was about self-determination, and it was about democracy, and that's perfectly valid and reasonable in its own right. And I think this goes back to what I was saying near the start of my talk, that there is much more. Well, there's varying degrees of understanding across the EU, but certainly in some quarters there's much more understanding now, where some people were puzzled 6 or 7 years ago as to why you'd want to leave the UK. It's a big EU member state. Well, can't you just have a bit more devolution? And now people see that. And I know not everybody who supports independence supports being in the EU, but the majority do. And I think talking more about wanting to work with our European partners and wanting to have a say in Europe can also be a positive part of that. And especially if we explain to people why, we may only have, if we were an EU member state like Denmark or Ireland, we'd only have a small percentage of the votes. But to talk about how these different countries work together, Ireland, going back to Ireland's foreign policy, Ireland was not only obviously very influential in explaining its interests and concerns about the Irish border and the Brexit talk, but it's had a much wider foreign policy, Global Ireland initiative in the last few years, and it's put a lot of effort into developing its relationship with key EU member states. I had somebody in Berlin recently say to me, well, I think Ireland is probably the most important small country, or has the best small country relationship with Germany at the moment of any other EU member states. So, that's probably getting too specific and European, because that's my default area. But I think, to me, democracy is extremely important. And that's why I was concerned both about the European Economic Area, about the ideas of soft Brexit. Democracy is about having control and not giving up power and unnecessarily holding power to account and making your own choices. And I think in the face of Brexit and this sort of irrational and ideological government in London, it's not just about the static costs and benefits economically of being in that union. It's about having a chance to take rational self-control. Yes, so I do think there's lots that could be done there. Thank you very much. And we are living in extraordinary times, unfortunately, a lot of them negative extraordinary times, but it means, we may be on the cusp of very different change, including positive change, hopefully.
You've been listening to a podcast by Pensioners for Independence. It was a meeting arranged by the Edinburgh and Lothians Pensioner for Independence group with Dr Kirsty Hughes, the Director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations. If you're interested in listening to more of Pensioners for Independence podcasts, please visit our website at www.pensionersforindependence.scot, where you can listen to all our podcasts and also find out what's going on in our local groups. And please sign up for more information if you'd like to do that.